but is the 1990s real estate bubble in Canada. It's not often talked about, and it's not something that there's many details that I can even research on when you go and look, because obviously the internet wasn't really around back then. And what kind of caused that? Because it was a similar speculation madness, wasn't it, in Toronto?
Yeah, I mean, it's very different because, first of all, the debt levels were much smaller. What caused that was interest rates went up to 13, 14%. The interest rates had peaked in 1981 at 19%, but then towards the end of the 80s, there was another peak in the interest rates that went up to 13, 14%, and that was too much for some of the speculators. And a big company called Olympia in York, a big real estate company, very big, Canary Wharf, and some of the big towers in Wall Street, big towers in Toronto, big towers in Calgary. Actually, they own the successor to that Olympia in York is called Brookfield, and they're big. They own most of the assets that Olympia in York owned before they went bankrupt. And that bankruptcy triggered a lot of things. So house prices went down about 40% in Toronto, but the bubble was tiny compared to what we have today. I mean, it's just I don't even know how to describe, you think of a mountain in Scotland, and then think of the Rocky Mountains west of Calgary. And that's the difference in the size between what was happening in 1990 and what's happening today. So the magnitude of things are just off the chart. Even the bubble in the U.S. in 2006, 2007, before it burst, and house prices went down 40%. It's a pretty small bubble compared to what we have today. The Canadian, Australia, and a few other countries, New Zealand, for some reason, the prices just kept going up and up, and they're way beyond the peak in 2006. To give you an idea, in 2006 in the U.S., the peak of investment in residential real estate was 6% of GDP, and it had never been that high. And it peaked right around the time of the bubble bursting, 2006, and it went all the way down below 3%, and it's now recovered back to about 4 or 5%. Canada was at 6% at the same time in 2006, and at that time, the government of the day under Stephen Harper and the finance minister was Jim Flaherty, they introduced zero down payment for mortgages, so you had no money down and 40-year amortization. So basically, that means anybody with a job can buy a house. So the payments are pretty small, and you don't have to have any down payments. So what happened was the investment in residential real estate in Canada went up to 8%, 7%, then 8%, and recently, just in the last couple of years, it's at 10% of GDP. And so the size of the bubble is just. And there's 220 cranes in Toronto active right now. There's 35 or so in Calgary, and this is like Toronto's the biggest by far. The second biggest city of number of cranes in North America is something like 50 or 60. I think it's Seattle or something. Toronto's 3 times the second biggest one, and even Calgary. With that bubble, up until recently, there was a bursting of the oil and gas bubble in 2014. Mm-hmm. Even Calgary's got 35 cranes, which is it ranks about 5th in North America. So wow. So it's just impossible to describe how big this bubble is in Canada. I've tried in the book to describe it, but it's just really hard to. I guess the only thing that probably compares is Japan in 1989. That was a pretty big bubble, but none of the recent bubbles. Like the 1991 in Canada, or even the 2006 one in the U.S., they don't really compare. The current bubble is 2 or 3 times the size of any of those. The one in 1989 in Japan was pretty enormous. So the government kept pushing the banks to lend money, and the business people, almost all the lending in those days was not to households, it was to corporations in Japan. And these corporations, they didn't have any projects. The bank would say, we want you to take another billion yen or whatever. Okay, well, they didn't really have any choice. They had to take it, right? And but instead of putting it into their business, they had no projects in their business to it was an economic miracle from 1945 to 1989, 44 years. The top car manufacturers, all these top consumer electronics companies, the Panasonics and all that, it was all built from nothing in 40 years. But at the end, what happened was the government kept telling the banks to lend to these people, and these people had to take the loans, and they didn't have anything to do with money. So what did they do? They bought real estate, right? So
Like
the real estate prices in Japan got ridiculously high because it was all based on borrowed money. And, it bottomed in about 25 or 30 years later. It was a 25 or 30 year bear market in real estate in Japan. And I think now it sort of seems to be turning the corner, but we're now
still struggling.
We're now 30 years, right? So the last 5 years or so, it hasn't gone up particularly, but it's not going down anymore. Let's put it that way. So.